Hi, this is Ken Adams, and welcome to this edition of the Valley View. And this week I'm joined by local author Jerry McGee. Although Jerry's had a very diverse background. You were superintendent of Fairview School here in Salem.
Fairview Hospital and Training Center. Mm-hmm.
Right. And you also were a city council person in Kaiser.
For 12 years.
And what other, I mean, you've done some gold mining as well as being an author.
I'm an amateur prospector,
Okay.
and did that for many years. Still have 3 claims that we go to, but it's more or less just for a good conversation more than anything else, I guess. But I have had some interesting things. I was involved in sports for many years. I coached every sport but basketball, I think. From baseball. Baseball is my major sport. But I started teaching at the high school that I graduated from, which I don't know that I would recommend that to everybody, because now I'm sitting in conferences with teachers that I'd given bad time to. So then I had right the day after graduation, I had a chance to go into heavy construction, and the Yale Dam on the Lewis River was being built at that time, and so I went into the tunnel, drilling the diversion tunnel, and didn't like the first couple weeks of it. You can't talk to anybody because of the noise. Interesting, they used the hand signals that were imported from Wales. Most of the miners were hard rock miners from the coal fields of West Virginia. So that was interesting to a Northwest boy. I was 17 years old. I had to kind of fudge to get into the union because you had to be 18. But at any rate, I started liking that style of life. And so each year, each summer, I'd go to work the day after school was out, and it would be pay for my next year of college. And that's how I worked my way through college. I eventually worked on 5 major dams in the Northwest, a major pipeline coming into the Ferndale, northern Washington, 32-inch oil pipeline coming from Canada. The same company, incidentally, that the Keystone line is involved with it. I smile out of that. I worked for them many years ago. But that, then, and another thing that may have been of some interest, I applied from Battleground, where I taught, I went to Roosevelt High School, where I started teaching disabled children and young men and women, and applied for, after about 7 years of teaching the so-called mentally retarded, they'd be called developmentally disabled now, but I applied for a national fellowship in national competition, and they only gave out 2 a year, and by heavens, I won the thing. So I went to University of Northern Colorado and got my doctorate degree there, and came back and worked for the Department of Education for a while, and then I went with the mental health division, and eventually became, I worked for 5 years as the executive director and lobbyist for the Oregon Association for Retarded Citizens. And then I went to work at Fairview and retired from as the director of the forensic program at State Hospital. So that's
a pretty good career.
Brings us up to date.
You know, I remember watching when I was younger a movie, and this guy was explaining that he only did a job for 3 years because he wanted to fully immerse himself in life, not just a career. And it sounds like you've kind of accomplished that.
I was on about a 5-year schedule until I got to Fairview, and then I was there 10 years. And I was the longest tenure that any superintendent ever experienced at Fairview was mine. Everyone had either passed away or was fired. And
Well, that's an accomplishment
yeah,
right there.
that certainly is.
Well, one of the things that I did recently is I read your book, It's a Long Way to Oregon, and it talks about some pioneers that settled in Kaiser, Oregon. But I was kind of amazed about their life before they even started to come west, because they moved around a lot. And this was in the 1840s,
Yes.
or late 1830s and
Yes.
1840s. And it was kind of interesting about how their life progressed from one area to another. And I was actually looking at my father's family history, and I realized that his family had done something very similar, that they originally started in Virginia, went to like South Carolina, Georgia, and then finally out to Arkansas.
That was very typical, and usually their jumps would be going westward always.
Right.
Quite often, from New York to Pennsylvania to the Ohio Valley, that was one route. And the family that I wrote about, the Kaiser family, and they were in the very first wagon train that came across what later became the Oregon Trail, but they went from North Carolina to Tennessee to Arkansas to Missouri. So and at each stop, they'd have a couple more children, it would appear. Now, by the time they got to Independence, Missouri, they had 10 children, 8 grandchildren, and 2 son-in-laws before they started Oregon. But their story was fairly typical of one little interesting thing. In most cases, you'd have to ask yourself, why would anybody subject their family, their wife and their family, to such an adventure? And in almost every case, it was the promise of free land.
Good free land.
Yes, yes. Now, an interesting thing happened. The 2 powerful senators from Missouri, Senator Lynn and Senator Benton, 2 of our counties are named after them, they pushed through an act through the Senate calling for free land, a section of free land for any pioneer brave enough and strong enough to get to Oregon to claim it. Well, a funny thing happened. While they were on their 6-month journey to Oregon, the House of Representatives killed the bill. 900 people were coming to Oregon with a promise of free land. And not knowing that while they were on their way out of all communications.
Well, yeah, they didn't have cell phones.
They did not have cell phones with them at that time. That the House killed it. And so it's interesting doing the research, why did they kill that bill? Well, they killed it maybe for many reasons. Some people thought Queen Victoria bought a few votes, incidentally. But the main reason was it wasn't our land to give away.
It was joint territory.
That's right, jointly occupied. And England had as much right to it as we did. And so it was not until 1850, 7 years later, that Congress finally passed the donation land claim. But that was kind of ironic. Here these people are plodding along, suffering every day with dust and dirt. But to finish up that little story very quickly, the word had already come around the Horn. And so the people at Champoeg and Oregon City knew of it, knew that the bill had failed. And so through a series of meetings called the Wolf Meetings, the topic of government logically came up. And those wise men, in their very first provisional constitution, provided a law and a bill that was almost identical to the Lynn-Benton bill. And they honored that for the next 7 years. So my family, Kaiser family, not my own family, but the family I wrote about, they staked their claim, and it was honored by everybody else until the law was eventually passed, which I think is truly remarkable.
Well, it shows some foresight. And the thing was, is the United States and people that were already living in Oregon wanted more settlers there to help establish it for the United States.
And that's exactly what Queen Victoria did not want, because that would change the balance of power. If this mob of Americans came over the Oregon Trail, the power would shift. It was Hudson's Bay had the control at that time, and she was quite right. And fortunately, it worked out. We don't say God save the Queen here. We say God bless America.
Well, yes, and I'm sure my Irish grandmother would be very upset
Yes.
about that. But you must have done a lot of research, and were there diaries and like that to help you kind of get into the mindset of some of these folks?
There was two important things. One was a book was written, a pamphlet more or less, was written by a descendant of Kaiser, Daisy Powers, and she had done a lot of genealogical work, excellent work in that. Then the main diary, in this way, usually the diaries were written by the women in the wagon trains, but there was no diary written by a woman that came out of that particular wagon train. But there was one by a Jim Nesmith, who was a young man, kept careful notes. Everybody on that wagon train, every death, every birth he recorded. And he was a single man, became very famous eventually became a U.S. Senator from Oregon. But he located in Polk County, in Rickreall area.
Oh, okay.
And he had an extensive diary that was a blessing for researchers for years. And so I used that very heavily.
And that was a long journey. It's almost 2,000 miles.
It was 2,000. Some say 2,020, but I always just, 2,000 is close enough.
Oh, okay.
And remember, they walked. People in the movies will see the people riding in the covered wagons. That wasn't generally the case because they were so blame uncomfortable. It was much easier to walk than to ride in those things. There would be springs in the actual seat where the rider might be. If it was horses, oxen were used primarily because there's so many advantages to the oxen that people don't generally think about, but the fact that they had a cloven hoof, so if they get in the mud or snow, they spread their toes for traction, where a horse can't do that. A horse with a solid hoof.
And the same with like a mule or something of that nature.
Right, right.
And so oxen were mostly used.
Oxen were exclusively used by the Kaisers. They drove 42 head of Morgan horses. And they joked later and said, we didn't drive them. They had a bell mare, a little Morgan mare that had a tinkly bell. And that according to the legend and the story, could have the horses, would start them in the morning, and by the various sounds that she could create, they give that little bell mare credit for preventing a stampede when the wagon train was trying to cross the three-island crossing on the Snake River. The cattle, they drove 4,000 head of cattle, if you can imagine that, and they were balking at crossing the Snake River, and they were milling around. And this little mare with her tinkly bell went into the river, followed by the other 41 Morgan horses, and then the cattle fell in behind. And so anyway, that's kind of an aside, but but the thing that I have found interesting, you start researching one direction and something else pops up. Usually it's kind of like trivia.
Right.
But it's so much fun I can think of so many little trivia things that must have been very important to the pioneers at the time. But
well, it's also there's a lot of accidents that happen. Like you don't plan on certain things, but actually quite often they work out. And so some of those little things, like having this little bell on the mare, helps them out later where they weren't planning on that. It's just something that was fortuitous because of the sound that it made.
Yeah. The I often thought that the statue should have been made to the little bell mare. Well, one thing they did not bring in their 5,000 head of cattle was sheep. And they lived to regret that. When they got out here, their clothing was tattered and torn.
Right.
They'd gone through their shoes. Many of them were barefooted, and they needed wool. The women tried weaving hair from wolves, believe it or not.
From wolves?
From wolves. But the strands were too short to really work. And so they had to negotiate with the Hudson's Bay Company. And Dr. McLaughlin provided sheep, wool first and then sheep, to where they could start their own. But they wish that they would have brought their own sheep, because McLaughlin was a tough trader.
Well, Hudson Bay Fur Company was known for its striking a hard bargain, I guess would be the way.
They were aggressive business people, that's for sure.
A couple of other books that you wrote were Follow the River and Lost and Found. And that talks about a couple of young people that are stranded in the coastal range of British Columbia.
Yes.
And it's they were involved with a small airplane crash, and one of them, the young boy, has a broken leg, and the young woman knows nothing about survival in the wilderness, although she's college educated and thinks of herself as fairly intelligent.
Yes.
And so they had quite an adventure, because they can't hike out. It's fall, and with a broken leg, you can't go anyplace. And he was worried that she wouldn't be able to survive on her own trying to walk out. And I've read Follow the River, which I found extremely interesting, and I was glad to hear that Lost and Found was the follow-up on that.
That was kind of interesting. I based a lot of that story, incidentally, on search and rescue work that I had been involved with. I was the founder of the Clark County Search and Rescue in Clark County, Washington, many years ago. They do search and search and rescue a little bit differently today, but at any rate, so it was based on that. But at the end of the book, the couple that you described, they leave, and they leave this diary hoping it would be found. But the story ends there. People did not like that. When you go to a movie, they want to see the ending of it. I thought that was kind of clever, that people could supply their own end.
Right, they could try to figure it out. That's what happened to them.
But I'd get letters saying, they should have both been killed, or why didn't you have them get married, or something. But there was no. So I thought, a good friend of mine said that either you write a sequel to that book, or I'm going to write a sequel to it. And so I took the challenge and wrote the sequel to it, and people became very happy with. When you read both books, it's an enjoyable experience. Now, you've read one, so you don't know what it turns out.
So don't spoil it for me.
I won't.
But one of the things that I found so interesting in Follow the River was all the kind of tips you gave people about how to survive in wilderness situations without really any kind of gear.
Yep, I was hoping that in all my books that I've written, I try to do several things. I try to say something that's educational, something that they perhaps did not know before. And that's what I did with the survival techniques. I try to also say something that they're going to laugh really out loud, get a good chuckle out of, and also something that they might even shed some tears over. So if I can get those three things into a book, I'm happy. And so I put in a lot of survival stuff. And the important thing of planning, plan for tomorrow. The survivors that you talk to that did survive had a plan going the next day. And some of it didn't amount to much. But in search and rescue, I was always amazed how, unfortunately, we found several people, particularly in bad weather, that were dead. And we'd find their clothing scattered along the trail. And in every case where we found clothing that you think that they would need, gloves, shoes, we found them dead. We did not find a single one of those alive. Now, how could anybody, with all the resources that are available in the Northwest, if they know how to put it together, get in the shelter, that's critical, and how to start a fire. Now, fortunately, I made it easy for my couple with starting the fire, but and as far as starving, why anybody would starve to death is beyond me, because one chapter in the book, if you recall, says if it moves, you can eat it.
Right.
Now, you may not want to eat it, and it may not taste good to eat, but anything that moves, you can eat, and a lot of stuff that doesn't move, you can eat. But now getting water is important. I didn't stress that enough in the book. You can't just drink from a nice running little stream, even in the Northwest. In the Northwest, it's called beaver fever.
Fever, yes.
And it's for real. The consequences are very unpleasant. So, but there's a number of ways that you can get water, safe drinking water.
Well, it rains enough, you should be able to collect it if you've got any kind of thing you can put together as a container.
Or even if you don't have a container, your T-shirt hanging out there, and then squeeze that T-shirt out.
With the dew even.
That's right, and collecting dew. There's a definite way you can collect dew, and that's a lot of water. You want to collect it before about 9:30 in the morning,
yes.
because it will soon be gone. But oh, I'm glad you picked up. I tried to put in a lot of hints of things that a person could do, and shelter is important, and every day you make your shelter a little better or a little stronger or a little more comfortable. And
well, we had a previous conversation, and you were, I was curious as to particular times when there would be people lost and found, and I was very surprised because you said it was while people were going out collecting Christmas trees. And I found that very interesting, that what happens to people when they're out looking for the perfect tree.
Yes, that is quite common. What do you do when you look for a tree? You walk around it, and then you walk around the other side, and then you see another tree up the hill, and so you do the same thing there. And before you know it, you are totally disorientated. You don't know what direction you've come from. And if a person just has the concept of moss growing on the north side of a tree, that helps, because if you know what direction north is, then you can figure everything else out. But that's very, very common. And when you're looking for someone who's lost, you can't overlook the logs, because people will crawl back under logs in this search of getting cover, then they're out of sight. So Christmas tree hunting is a good family event, but a dad or someone has got to know, keep aware of directions, or they will get lost.
And it's also a case too, sometimes they haven't worn the right clothing for
Yeah,
it.
that's right, because they're just going to go out for a short while.
Right.
And I'll guarantee you one thing: if they don't if they don't orientate right, you will, and become confused, you will walk in a big circle. It is invariably, it'll happen. So there's some very easy techniques, even if you can't read a compass or know how to make your own compass, is just looking at some element, a mountaintop or a snag or something ahead of you. And the other thing, I'm rambling on here.
Well, no, it's important information.
You have to, when you're going for that snag that you see up on the hillside, to keep it in a straight line, you better turn around frequently and look behind you.
Because
and to keep, so you know which way you're going.
Well, and like I know myself that generally, I guess I pick up landmarks as I'm walking, and I seem to have a pretty good sense of direction, but I've known people, even in my own family, who have terrible sense of direction. They cannot figure out where they are at any particular time. I've seen them turn the wrong way on a freeway and head out to Las Vegas instead of Los Angeles. And it's just amazing to me. But there are people, I mean, I don't know what it is that causes that.
You're looking at one.
Oh, you do have trouble.
I have trouble. Now, I have a daughter who has tremendous sense of direction. But I do not have. And I can't trust my own.
Oh, okay.
I can sit down, like I'll say, the joke is I have never been lost, but I have been badly confused many times. But you're right, it's a sense that somebody have. Now, the other thing, so many of our rivers or creeks are meandering.
Right.
In an oxbow fashion, like the Sandy River. So you cross it and the water is flowing one way. Go a short distance and cross it again and the water is flowing the other way because of the oxbow. If you don't pick that up, as I say, I had a daughter that was very good, and I get lost very easy. And you lose a lot of energy. The moment you realize that you are lost, then the energy just seeks out. I was taking a group of people up to some mines on Mount St. Helens, and I got badly confused. And this one fellow came up and he said, "McGee, you have no idea where you might be." And I said, "You're right." I told him we were all sitting down taking a 5-minute break. I said, don't say anything. And because everybody would get tired. We'd been at this a long time, and hiking through, not on a trail, just through the brush. And so he went to right angles and found the trail in a short while and made me look good. But and I kept telling the people would ask, well, how much further is it? And I say, oh, just about a quarter of a mile further. And another half hour would go by. How far is it? About a quarter of a mile. And they gave me the nickname of Quarter Mile McGee.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's something that happens like every year, though. People get lost, they get confused, maybe they fall, and when they get up, they have a hard time trying to locate where they are. And one piece of advice that you gave is when you realize you're lost, the first thing you need to do is sit down and think about how you're going to find your way, because too many people then panic and just start walking fast or running, trying to figure out where they are.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Sometimes just sitting right where you're at, you can think through the morning where you had been. You see, I had crossed the creek about an hour ago, so that would be, and it starts to sort itself out. And fatigue is, you gotta take care of yourself.
Right.
And so you got to get water. Food is not so important.
You can go without food for a while.
Time, yeah. And you can eat some pretty miserable things to help you out that way.
You can always find insects.
Yep, yep. It's not, think of the bear. That's
right.
exactly what he does. He puts his paw on the anthill and watches it, and when the ants get on her, then he takes his meal and he does it over again.
Well, Jerry, we've run out of time, and this has been a very good conversation, and I want to thank you for stopping by.
I've enjoyed it.
And this has been Valley View, and come back next week.